Sometime in my teenage years, when my mother must have been doing some extra family history, I found a little A5 size card with a detailed genealogy I'd never seen before, with not just names but glimpses and snatches of stories going all the way back to the 17th century. I was hooked. As a child, I had loved learning stories from history, but at that young age I was struck by a vision of my own family's involvement in the events, discoveries and challenges of all those different periods I found so interesting. I was especially proud of a note about one of my ancestors who had fought for the famed Admiral Nelson at the Battle of the Nile during the Napoleonic Wars. Last year, one day while I was waiting for my sons to finish playing tennis, I took a walk through a cemetery. It was peaceful, but humbling. As I read numerous headstones, I felt a kind of vicarious sadness at these people's absence and was mindful of the suddenness and brevity of the information I could see about their lives. Name, dates of death, and perhaps a brief sentimental message of mourning. But that was all. On one headstone I saw 4 names, 3 generations, whose lives were punctuated by World War. Though there was no detailed information, I could imagine stories of love and sadness, of people battling global and personal catastrophe. I've changed the names to respect privacy and have added brief comments inspired by the dates. Just think of how all that had happened had vanished into a dash between the years. Eliza Burley, 1875 to 1940. So was almost 40 when the Great War began, and died as Britain was still under attack in the Second World War. Emily Allison, 1941 to 1945, lived just 4 years, all of them war years. Her grandmother never saw her or knew her. Thomas Allison, 1907 to 1953. Father lived only 8 years after his daughter died. Clara Allison, 1907 to 1986, same age as her husband as when they got married, but childless for 41 years and widowed for 33 years. I thought then of The Dash, a poem by Linda Ellis. I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from beginning to end. He noted that first came the date of birth and spoke of the following date with tears, but he said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time they spend alive on earth, and now only those who loved them know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love, and how we spend our dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that can still be rearranged. To be less quick to anger and show appreciation more and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, remembering that this special dash might only last a little while. So when your eulogy is being read, with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they say about how you lived your dash? I have chosen to call this little talk Discovering Thomas Worgman's Dash, and want to share with you a few reflections on the journey of finding, but then also getting to know one of my ancestors. Sometime in the autumn of 2015, just a year or so into my new teaching history career, and perhaps partly because of it, I began to dig around for more details of my Worgman ancestry that I had been exploring as a young man in my teens. It used to be the case that asking elderly relatives memories was a great first step, and while I did speak to family, I was also able to take advantage of the unusual Worgman surname and simply see what Google could turn up. If you try it, you'll be likely to be led to a couple of them, both 19th century artists, Theodore Blake, whose work hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London, and Charles, who took Western art, cartoon in particular, to Japan, and is considered one of the forefathers of manga art. In time, my research meant that I gravitated to these artists' brothers grandfather, a man called Thomas Workman, whose notes were on the slightly more plentiful side on this family history chart that I'd been given, and which claimed that he had been known to the French King Louis XVIII and had been given an appointment to the Order of the Fleur-de-Lis, a sort of knighthood. I also discovered that he had been a gifted linguist, what is known as a polyglot or speaker of many languages. He was the son of a Swedish migrant, so I presume he knew that language, but in addition to English he could also speak French and German fluently enough to translate and simplify complex philosophical essays. I also discovered that he'd been ridiculously rich, and had devoted his life and much of his fortune to publicising the new ideas of a German philosopher called Immanuel Kant. This last point came to shape his life. One day, as I browsed a digitised book on a website called archive.org, written by a man who had influenced Thomas's beliefs, I electronically flipped back through some of the opening pages and was stunned, literally stunned to find, like a needle in a haystack I didn't know I was searching, his signature, Thomas Workman's signature in this book. I have no idea how this book came to be in a Boston library in America, and then scanned and put onto this website, of all the places that it could have been. But imagine my excitement and my sense of connection with him as I realised what I was looking at, a signed book, something that had meant so much to him, which now was thousands of miles away over in Eastern America. In 1796, some 16 years before a flurry of self-published essays, Immanuel Kant had become Thomas's hero, and something of a pattern that he would try to emulate, a man whose humble beginnings echoed his own, and whose ideas compelled a burning, inflexible vision of what the world most needed to know. Irrespective of what Kant's philosophy has meant for anyone else, and I don't pretend to understand that well, for Thomas it came to mean the following. First, and above all else, fate was not predestined. Instead, man, woman, was demonstrably free to choose, able, empowered, and responsible for creating character. Secondly, Kant's philosophy was science to him, a way to prove the dual nature of man, a temporal, five senses equipped mortal with an eternal, reasoning spirit soul. This dual nature inferred the imperative of an ethical, morally aware life, a life by which one prepared to rejoin God. Finally, that it was an absolute duty to teach this truth, come what may, that conflict and crime could literally cease throughout the world. And this is what all of this philosophy meant to him. These convictions were truths that he lived by, he loved utterly, and for which he was ridiculed, rejected, and forever marginalised by prominent romantic thinkers of the time, such as Thomas de Quincey, Augustus de Morgan, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This was all happening in the early years of the 19th century, the early 1800s. Researching the biography of a deceased relative is as unpredictable, exciting, and exasperating as getting to know any living person. In spite of being, as one 20th century academic called him, the most prolific writer on Kant of his generation, in his own era, Thomas's enthusiasm became an embarrassing kind of freakishness. His work, his interpretations, his insistence met with contempt and relegating him to the margins of society. One prominent writer of the time said of his work, "The most abstruse metaphysical researches have, for years, been carried on by a working silversmith." This 4 times great-grandfather, Thomas Workman, was a silversmith, a skilled metalworker, a maker of jewellery. So the most abstruse metaphysical researches have, for years, been carried on by a working silversmith. Writings on the philosophy of Kant, composed while he went about with silver plate and scissors to his customers. Mr. Workman, a very respectable old blockhead, is not a journeyman, but a master tradesman with a town and country house. Think of that in the first place. Secondly, he has no sort of connection with the mechanic institutes or any new lights of any description. Having published his metaphysical researches, such as they are, many years ago in the Encyclopaedia Londinensis. Thirdly, he is not a person whom any party needs to be proud of, having done nothing but degrade and misrepresent Kant by the heap of stupidities which he has fathered upon him, and the absolute Babylonian gibberish in which he has delivered them. So this was a really powerful rejection of all that he was doing, he was passionate about these things. And it was fascinating for me to discover his writings and these writings of other people. And to be absolutely honest, I was fortunate to find this all at the click of buttons on Google. To be fair, I have come to see this obsessiveness in my ancestor, and I can imagine how hard he might have been to reason with. I sometimes wonder how he would have responded to missionaries. He believed in God, and he developed a religious-like zeal in sharing what he thought would prove the realities of eternity and of God. I would have loved to have met him, and in some ways, going through this process, I feel as though I have come to know him. Imagine, again, just remind you of that experience of reading through this digitized book that was thousands of miles away, one of many books in a library over in Boston, and discovering it was a book that actually had belonged to him. He had signed it. And through this process, I really do feel like I have got to know him better. In a rare sharing of his feelings, he wrote just a year or so before he died, "Long, very long, have I exerted myself to plant this science of mind." He was convinced that these things that he was learning would help people's outlook and perspective on life. And it's fascinating to me, as a quick aside, that my own passion and interests in people's perspectives and the idea of mentality and of mindset and all of those things, I've inherited from this ancestor 200 years or so before me. So again, long, very long have I exerted myself to plant this science of mind in my native country, but I regret to say without success. Nay, my exertions have sometimes been stigmatized as impious, and my motives impugned, as wishing to undermine the very revelation he means of Christ I have laboured so hard to support. But such is my enthusiasm that, like the shipwrecked mariner who works at the pump to prolong his earthly existence till the vessel founders and all is lost, so I will never cease to fight the good fight till my earthly body is wrecked and my soul called to its last account. After selling his jewellery shop, Thomas bought a country house near to what is now the location of the London Temple. As far as I can tell, his house and estate has vanished now beneath Gatwick Airport. Thomas became a widower in 1832 and moved back to London in 1834, where during his first night he was robbed as he lay in bed by the very removal men who had moved him to London from Sussex. So an Old Bailey court script reveals. And again, I found that on Google by various searches with the surname. In December 1840, some 69 years after his birth in 1771, he passed away, probably still hoping, as he wrote in his final publication, but should the reverse of this pleasing dream, that his ideas should be taught in schools, take place, and should the almost exhausted efforts of its author still be met with the same apathy and indifference which have stigmatized the last 40 years of his existence, his theory, together with his dialogues, must forever die, unless indeed, like the Pythagorean theory of the celestial bodies, after a lapse of many thousand years, it should find another Copernicus to bring it into play. Now, when I read that, I was kind of intrigued and fascinated and quite excited about it. As a historian, I'm aware of the reference that he makes here to the way in which knowledge was reformed and restored and reshaped in the Renaissance period. And he's talking about how the Earth, they believe people used to believe that the Earth was the centre of the universe until philosophers and thinkers managed to prove that it was not that way and that the sun orbited the Earth. And the reason that he makes that reference is that he really believed that this German philosopher had changed perspective on the meaning of life so much that it turned everything on its head and reversed everything that people knew. And that's what he was thinking. And, though I suspect I can't redeem his ideas, and I'm not sure that his ideas, it may have been that many of his ideas deserved the criticism that they had at the time. But just right now, I'm attempting to write his story and to find meanings in his life, an attempt to celebrate and demonstrate the importance of every life, every dash between the date of birth and the date of death. As the great poet William Blake wrote, who incidentally was a contemporary of Thomas Workman and a mutual friend of a man that my ancestor knew, another artist, the great poet William Blake wrote, "To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour," is the prompting that has driven me to understand the meanings of this ancestor's life. And I'm so thankful that I've been able to discover these little bits and pieces, these little details, that his life hasn't just disappeared into this little dash, and that in understanding all of the adventures of his life and the ups and the downs and the excitements and the griefs, I begin to understand a little bit more the meanings of my own life, and begin to understand a little bit more the feelings that I have and the interest that I have in certain areas. And I see myself, I see him, and I see myself in him just a little bit. And really thankful to have the opportunity to have shared this story with you. And I leave it with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.